Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And this week, this episode is going to be a lot of politics with my friend, Peter Osnos, who is the author of a new book called An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. Peter, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks very much, Robert.
Now, Peter, I didn't warn you, but I have guests introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, imagine you've arrived at a dinner party, and I know from reading your book, you've been to a couple, that introduce yourself in, say, 30 or 45 seconds, if you don't mind.
Well, I think the first thing I should say under the circumstances is I've been Robert Bryce's publisher now for 20 years, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm honored to be here today. This is a fellow you want to work with if you got a book to publish. The story is basically I'm a fellow in my 8th decade and have a very, very long history now in publishing and journalism, which includes a lot of, I would hopefully describe as colorful and interesting episodes. The book is called An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen, because that's in fact what it is. It's a story of someone whose participation in life was curiously matched by being very much an observer, or as Yogi Berra actually did say, you can observe a lot by watching.
Well, so now you flatter me by saying you're my publisher. I'll get my conflicts of interest out of the way. I've written 6 books. All have been published by Public Affairs, which was the imprint that Peter founded in 1995. 97. Okay.
We're 24 years old, and I still say no longer a startup and not yet an antitrust case.
Right. So, Peter, now it's my turn to, I read the entirety of your memoir, and I've had a lot of authors on this podcast, and I will admit I haven't read their books cover to cover. I read yours, read every word, and I found it to be really compelling, and I enjoyed it quite a lot. And if I didn't know you, I'd swear you made the whole thing up. I mean, it's like, I don't know, is it Zelig who shows up everywhere
except that I'm not Woody Allen.
Yeah. Okay. But your book is stuffed with bold-faced names. So the obvious question is, why did you write it?
Well, I wrote it, as I say at the beginning of it, I wrote it when I started working on it when my teenage grandson, Ben Sanford, said to me one day, tell me the story of your family in World War II. And I said, but Ben, it's our family. And then it's when I realized that unless I were to go into the history of my family and my life, then a lot of it would never last. It just doesn't in the way the world works. Sure, I have a ton of clippings, but that's not really the issue. The issue is what went on and what it felt like. And so I embarked on what essentially is a reported memoir. Memoir and autobiography and the various ways the language is used. Memoir tends to sort of mean memory. But in my case, because I've been a reporter for my entire adult life, I wanted to do all the reporting. So I went back and then literally reported all the way back well before I was born and almost until today. And with my wife and sometimes with my grandsons and friends, we traveled the world, went to Poland where my family was from, went to India where I was born and left in a basket. So I had not ever really lived there. And now I was able to do this and find out a great deal. I went to Cambodia and Vietnam because that's where I'd been a reporter. And I interviewed a whole lot of people because my sense of memory is that memory is tricky. So I wanted to be sure that when I was saying things that I was reflecting reality and not memory. So I did a whole lot of reporting. And that's why I think as memoirs go, it's a little unusual in the sense that it is very reported. And when you mention names, I say in the introduction that one of the things I've learned, there's no index in this book. You know why there's no index in this book? Because I know that too many people just go right to the index and then they put the book down if they're not there. So I've been publishing a long time, Robert. I know the tricks. So, but I say in the beginning that what I discovered that when you use names, the only things people notice is if their names are not there for one reason or another. And why am I not there? Wasn't I important? So I say, if a lot of names bother you, skip over them and get to the ones you want to know about. One of my techniques as a publisher, editor, and writer is to address the reader on the reader's own terms, meaning, what is it that the reader is going to believe when they see, what is the reader going to think when they see all those names? Well, they're going to know that somebody out there likes the fact that they're there. And I also say that there's almost, I assume, virtually no descriptions in the book that people would not recognize of themselves. If somebody is tall, thin, and blonde, and you call them short, fat, and bald, it's just horrifying. So what I tried to do was make sure that I was not telling people something that they didn't know about themselves, but maybe helping them understand who they were. We're talking here about really, literally the full spectrum of the human race here, from my, personal most, infants and so forth, to multiple major world figures, the presidents of the United States, the presidents of the Soviet Union and Russia, really hugely significant figures in every aspect of life, which was my privilege to encounter. Plus, two of the most important sort of wars of the latter part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century. One was Vietnam, where I covered the war, and two were the Soviet Union, which at that time was in the middle of the Cold War.
Right.
So the full panoply, the full spectrum of stuff is vast, I acknowledge. And the reason for doing it is that now it's there. And I say at the beginning of the book, a book is better than a building. It's got your name on it, can't be torn down. And I
like that.
fully expect that people long after I've gone to my reward will have the opportunity, certainly among my family, to read the book. In addition to which, Robert, there is a website which we created called, and especiallygoodview.com virtual attic, which I can describe to you is a real innovation. My own sense of it is, it's everything you'd find in an attic placed on a website to illustrate things in the book, but also to tell a very much greater story of my family and history, my history, and so forth. And it's well worth your time, and it's free, and there's no password.
Right. No, I looked at the website, and there's a tremendous amount of material there.
Right.
So I thought it was interesting. You described yourself as a reporter, because I guess that's how I see myself, and that I still basically consider myself a journalist and a reporter. I've written books, but I still write like I report. But you're also 78 now.
77. Don't age me.
77. Okay, 77, and you're a first-time author at age 77. That in itself is rather remarkable, isn't it? Given that you say I'm a first-time author. It's the first time that I've written and published a full book. I've been writing relentlessly, of course,
for literally 60 years,
right,
in every conceivable format, except a full book. And the explanation for that is that the logical times for me to have done that probably would have been after Vietnam and after the Soviet experience. That's when typically American journalists finish their Soviet experience and then go off, take a leave, and write a book about what are Russians really like.
Right.
The truth is, I had a very good idea, which imploded because I had written, doesn't matter. I wrote a little something that was about the family that I wanted to write a book about. They were offended, so they gave some of the book to somebody else. And then I became the foreign editor of the Washington Post, which is to say I was busy. But I have been writing almost weekly for years and years and years. I call it brain exercise. It's my way of framing ideas clearly, because I'm allowed to have opinions and so forth. But none of this, and curiously, Robert, did I ever do for a living, if you know what I mean.
How do you mean? How do you mean that?
I was never dependent on the kindness of publishers or editors. I guess that was sort of deliberate. I think one of the things that I've recognized about myself is that almost really from the beginning, I'm kind of self-directed. Instinct leads me to do things. I've changed careers. I have come to recognize that, I mean, in fact, in publishing the book is a perfect example of that. When I finished the book, writing the book exactly a year ago, we're in Lakeside, Michigan, which is where we spend the summers, and my wife's family's been for 100 years. I finished it and I said, well, I knew I told people I was writing it, but I never said what I was going to do with it because I didn't know. And when we finished, and I thought about an agent, and I actually, contacted one agent to see what the instincts were. I realized I couldn't do that. I could not find an agent, have the agent send the book around. God forbid it was turned down by 40 people. Maybe one would want it or two, and then there'd be an auction. I said to my wife, that's just not going to happen. I said, what we're going to do instead is we're going to create our own publishing company, this is not a self-published book. We created a publishing company. It's called Platform Books, LLC, fully established. And what I did to put the book together is what you would do if you were making a movie or a play. It's just put together a team. So I put together a team of the very accomplished people I've worked with over the years who were in a position to work with me. And it was really top tier. And Robert, your editor, Lisa Kaufman, was the first person to read the material and was immensely helpful.
Yeah, she is remarkable, and I mean, just truly remarkable. If I've had my books have had any success, it's all due to her, honestly.
Well, that's not really the case. If you hadn't written them, they wouldn't have been a success. But that's a whole nother lunch. Look, the point is that what we did was publish the book,
right?
Which is different from self-published. In other words, I didn't hire somebody to put covers on it and stick it on Amazon. We're fully published. The book is available for sale everywhere.
Right.
Now, let me just say this, Robert.
Sure.
As of today, the audio is available. That took a little longer than I anticipated because I ended up reading it myself.
Right. Well, let's talk about the book because, as I said, it's a remarkable. I mean, if I hadn't read it and I didn't know you, I would say, "Wow!" I mean, it's just almost too incredible to believe. But let's start about from the beginning and your parents' escape from Warsaw. Your father went to Bucharest after the Nazis had invaded and sold cars, saved money. And one of the things that I noted from that was that he had a suit made and had a Hamburg hat made. Mm-hmm. Tell that story.
Well, the truth, what happened was that the Nazis invaded in September 1st, 1939. My father's military unit that he was assigned to, by the time he got there outside east of Warsaw, it basically disbanded. He couldn't get back to Warsaw. My mother and my brother, who was 8 at the time, were in Warsaw, and they all assumed that this would be over quickly. So he did get to Bucharest, where my mother and brother endured the worst of it. The Nazis arrived. There were bombings. There were terrible incidents of brutality, which my mother and my brother endured, although with extraordinary courage of a certain kind. And then my father had the notion that rather than show up at the Romanian Foreign Ministry to get a visa from my mother, it's called a promisa, which is the visa to get into Romania, and just be treated as a bedraggled refugee. He did. He had a suit made, custom made, and a Hamburg hat. My father was an imposing fellow. Black hair, jet black hair, blue eyes, dark skin, and spoke perfect French because they had lived in Paris for the first half of the 30s. So he shows up at the Romanian Foreign Ministry and he has a name, Mr. Popescu, and he's sent to see Popescu. It turns out Popescu is the foreign minister, and because my father doesn't look like a bedraggled refugee with nothing to offer. The foreign minister's office and the foreign minister says, look, the consular officer's name is Popescu, and he gives him a note, take care of this man. So it was that note, which was the promissa, which enabled my mother and brother to get into Romania. But remember, they had to get out of Poland. You couldn't get out of Poland just like that. You had to find a way to get an exit visa. The first thing they had to do was convert. They were baptized, and they managed to get from Warsaw to Berlin, which at the time was extraordinary. Nobody was doing that, but they did it. Once they got to Berlin, my mother actually had a cousin, and she took my brother there and said to the cousin, listen, we need some help in getting on to Bucharest. And the cousin said, why would you want to leave now? And the cousin, and incidentally, this is what's reporting. I found the great-granddaughter of that cousin. And I said, why in God's name did that person want to stay in Berlin in 1939, in the early 40s? And the woman said, she lives in California. She said, well, this is the thing. You see, he had a much younger wife. My family myth was that she just had plastic surgery. I can't prove that. But she had a much younger wife. She didn't want to leave all her possessions behind. She had all these beautiful rugs and they had lots of money.
Right. And
they end up dead. He was going to loan my mother the money, which she never had to repay because he was then dead. But she literally walked out on the balcony with my brother in her arms, and she said, either you give us the money or we'll jump. And then he did, and they get to Bucharest, where my father's at the station with roses. Then they managed to get from Bucharest, where there's an earthquake. At the time of the earthquake, my father encounters the consul general of Turkey, both of them in their PJs, presumably. He gets a transit visa to Turkey for the family. And then they get to, from Turkey, they go to Iraq.
To Baghdad, right?
That's right. Where they meet a man who is ostensibly, they're told, is an English, a Brit. John Mish, M-I-S, with some kind of emphasis, and he's apparently an English language teacher, probably almost certainly MI6. And he says, "Well, no, you can go. I can get you into India, at least for a while." That's what happens. They get to India in the late spring of 1940, and I say in the book, they arrived with really nothing more than their wits. They stayed in India until the very end of 1943. I was born in October of 43. I always assumed the reason there's a 12-year difference between my brother and me is that was the moment which they felt safe enough to have a second child. When we went to India and visited all the places that they had lived and worked, it's an astonishing story. I mean, they got there, as I say, with nothing more than their wits, and they left. They had a beautiful apartment overlooking the best cricket place in Bombay. They had, it's not a big deal in India, 5 servants. They had 5 servants. They had good jobs. And, but they were managed to get, again, through wiles and guiles and luck, ultimately, they got a very, very, very hard to get visa to the United States. And the visa, the announcement, they got the telegram in April, they left in December at the end of the year. That year, the quota of Jews getting into the United States, 1943-44, was about 8% of the whatever the numbers that could have been. And there was very, very few people got in. They did. They crossed the Pacific on a troop ship. There were civilian passengers on a ship that was first transporting Italian POWs to Australia. And then from Australia to California, they were bringing home returning GIs. So again, they got to California, they got to New York. Once again, they were now about 40 with just their wits. And by the time I was old enough to know what was going on, they were building their first weekend house. So these are people who coped and thrived despite extraordinary odds. And have to remember, Robert, and this is why I tell the story in the detail that I do, I was not part of that life. I came along when they were safe. And I grew up in an entirely, half of their lives were spent in a very different culture, in a very different place, through events and traumas that I cannot even imagine. And then I come along and grow up in this country with a family that is here and in every measurable respect successful. So I wanted to tell that story in detail.
Sure.
Because if my grandson would never know it. There's a whole lot of stuff also about my mother's family, which was a very interesting family. My father's family was an interesting family. So the point is that story, which is not a unique story. I said that anybody who made it out of Poland in 1939, 1940 has a story.
Sure.
Otherwise they wouldn't be out. So that was the first part of it. And then the rest of it seemed logical. I mean, not quite chronological because, but I decided that I had to tell the story of my growing up, because if I didn't, you wouldn't really understand how the hell I got to be the person I am. So I told the story of my background. Then I told the story of my schooling and sort of early career. And then I focused on Vietnam and the Soviet Union and my career as a newspaper journalist.
Right.
And then the move I made to publishing.
Right. Well, that part that you just discussed, I thought was really interesting because you said that in the book you refer to your parents as Europeans and yourself as an American, and it seemed to me that you also kind of felt that way something about your late brother Robert, who I guess passed just last year, right? That he was
right.
that was a key difference between that there was a divide even in your home as a child between how is that fair for you identifying?
I don't want to make
American.
it sound like it was negative.
No,
but
no,
I do say,
I don't mean that.
We were strangers with the same DNA.
There you go.
And that was really the essence of it. Remember that my brother, from the ages of 8 to 12, when they arrived for 4.5 years, lived through unspeakable challenge. I mean, the traumas. And even in India, after they'd been there a while, they sent him off to a boarding school, a perfectly good boarding school, and where he was told, don't tell anybody you're Jewish, we've had enough trouble. And interesting, the boarding school, which I went to visit, which is up in the hills about several hours away from Bombay, its most famous graduate of this school, it was called at that time the European Boys School, is still there, very much now all Indians, of course. The most famous graduate was Freddie Mercury, Queen.
No kidding.
Yeah, his picture's all over the place. So,
well, is that what drove you? I mean, because that's the other thing, Peter, that as I read the book, that this incredible history of your family and that enduring those unspeakable things that happened in Warsaw and fleeing the Nazis and having, as you say, the wiles and guiles, but was that what drove you? Because I mean, that's the other thing that to me, as I read the book, and I mean this no flattery here, but you had an incredible amount of drive throughout the whole thing you had good jobs and then you left them, you left the Washington Post, you could have, I hate to say it this way, but loafed a little more, but I don't detect any loafing.
No, look, Robert, you as someone who's written 6 books, you would know that an awful lot of what you are is baked in. And what I understand, again, one of the purposes of writing this book was to get acquainted with who I am. As I say in the beginning, that's risky. What if I didn't like the person I found? What if I thought I turned out to be vain or arrogant or any of these other things? Truth of the matter is, what I discovered, and is really kind of one of the main discoveries of the book, is the degree to which I have always been sort of self-motivated or self-directed. I'm very personable. I like people. I'm gregarious, but it turns out that a whole lot goes on that is below the surface, which is why I could leave the Washington Post when I did. It's why I could leave Random House when I did. It's why I could leave public affairs when I did.
Let me interrupt you there, because it's interesting that you say that. A journalist that I knew here in Austin, it's a long time ago, she said, what you write, you don't pick what you write, it picks you. And I thought about that a lot. So this was just what we were supposed to do then. I mean, there seems
I don't think there's no question.
There's something in the memoir that just it feels like, well, you were supposed to be there, right? That this was, I don't believe necessarily in fate, but that you had this sensibility about yourself throughout your career. It seems that, well, I'm going to make this happen, and whatever the odds are.
I would say in retrospect that is the case. The point about it is really, though, Robert, I mean, I knew early on that it was when I look back at my 6th grade yearbook. I didn't know what to call it, but basically I was calling it journalism.
Right.
I mean, I was, my European father never once said, "Let's go in the backyard, I'll throw a ball at you."
Right.
He just never did that. What he did do was read the New York Times and the World Telegram and the Herald Tribune.
Right. And like you, I grew up with newspapers. I still love the newspaper. I read a lot of digital stuff, but I'd still love the paper. And that was one of the things that really resonated. Let me jump back. So you're the story of your father's clothes, and you identify in the story, and I'm going to jump to some, discussion of books and so on, but you talk about your father's clothes in the book and how important they ended up, in fact, may have saved your family. And you became then known as a sharp dresser, and I've seen your clothes are even nicer than mine.
Well, that's good.
I'm guessing you don't own a hoodie.
Well, you know what? It's funny. I do have hoodies. I do. No, I'll tell you what it is. I did not appreciate the impact of DNA. Sort of the things that are in you that you're not aware of. I mean, no one ever told me as a child, you want to have a crease in your pants. My father never said that. But why is it that in junior high school, I insisted on only wearing, pants that had a front crease? Why? How did I end up being called by Sally Quinn, the arbiter of style in Washington in that era, the best dressed man at the Washington Post? I always used to joke that it was a low bar. But the truth is, that's something she said. I didn't say it about myself. Right. And it's not as though, I spend a huge amount of time and energy on the subject. Yeah. When I lived in Asia and eventually the UK, I did, I had a tailor and I did have shirts made.
Sure.
Because I liked to.
Right.
I always say to my wife when she'd say, "That's awfully expensive," I say, "Yeah, but at least it's not crack cocaine." So anyway, or a mistress, right? Well, that's certainly true. But the thing is that I don't know where that came from, but I have to assume that I was seeing my father look elegant.
Right.
And therefore, on some level, elegance of a certain kind was instilled in me, as was a kind of, curiosity and intellectual tradition in particularly my mother's family. My mother's family goes hundreds of years. They were one of the leading literary families in Poland. They had one of the best publishing houses in Poland. So there are things that you don't know you have. They're just there. And if life does not clobber you in some unexpected direction, you tend to go to where those instincts that you don't even know you have really lead you. And again, think about it. My ability to make certain really dramatic shifts at various points in my adult life and career, particularly, were not all that different from my father getting out of, from my parents and getting out of Poland, and my parents getting out of India and coming to New York and starting again and creating businesses. My mother was a biochemist. My father and 2 other fellows said, it's hot in New York in the summers, and they picked up on air conditioning, and that firm is still around all these years later.
I just think Airville is the company.
Airville, AIRV. I think my father used to say, I always thought one of my father's greatest joys and pride was not just his sons. It was the fact that he was the sponsor of the 8 a.m. weather report on the New York Times radio station WQXR. He loved being sponsor of the weather report at 8 o'clock on WQXR. So I would say that that some of these things you do on your own, and some of these things are just there, and they're going to happen if nothing gets in the way. Meaning, if you don't get clobbered along the way by some form of illness, or you choose a way of life that's going to change the way you live. And then that happened to me. And so I became what I think I was destined to be, which is an observer and a reporter and a person who is genuinely, again, another thing that's surprising, Robert, that I imagine I didn't fully appreciate. I also, even though I'm a talker, turns out I'm a listener, or else I couldn't have written this book. There's an awful lot of stuff in there which comes from just having listened, absorbed, and even in ways I didn't fully appreciate. And that's, again, something that you don't know about yourself until you have to confront it.
Right. Well, let me come back to that, because you talk later about your own bouts with depression over the last few years, which I thought was some really brave and revealing reporting on yourself. But let me jump back to this your that identity issue, because you wrote in the book, you said that about what it means to be a Jew, not as a member of a synagogue or fraternal group, but rather through an awareness of our history of travail and triumph. Family is my community. Believing in the power of resilience has become, this is one of the things you end the book with, but you said believing in the power of resilience has become something of a cliche to offset our embedded gloom and strife at events and crises. If the human race, for all it has been through over the millennia, were not resilient, we certainly would not have gotten this far. That is said so often because it is right. Was that, and I'll tell you, I grew up Catholic in Oklahoma. I mean, it's about as far away from being a Jew in New York as, culturally, not necessarily distance wise. But the way you wrote about it, I thought was very moving. Was that outsider status? Was that one of the things that drove you as well? I mean, just that.
Well, I think it is. I'm sure it is. Although outsider, one of the things that people who write memoirs are accused of is saying, "Well, I was always an outsider, and somehow, nonetheless,
and it always snowed and it was always raining." Yeah, right.
Look, I was a participant in everything I did, but curiously, I was also watching, which is why I start the book with a wonderful little anecdote about my son and me at a baseball dinner in Greenwich, Connecticut, which was a dinner, the Portuguese and the Americans, Italians, Americans, the cops, he was on Hilltop, Texaco, and the next few weeks, everybody coming in the house, I would describe in great detail the lasagna and the ziti and this and that. And finally, my son, who was 12, says, "Dad, you remind me of Jane Goodall. You go to the dinner with your tape recorder, your notebook, and you say, 'Isn't it amazing they show affection for their young?'" And that is a characteristic. I will go to an event and will characterize the event in my head sociologically, as well as being present. It just goes with the territory. I went to where we are out here on Lake Michigan. There's a country club, of which we're not members, but my family, lots of them are our members. And they had a big event on July 4th, fireworks and stuff. And I go to the event and other people are there to have the fireworks and eat the, food. And I go there and I come back and say, what was amazing? There's 1,000 people there, and virtually all of them, there were maybe, 3, 4, 5 people who were not white in the classic sense of white.
Right.
One was an adopted Black kid who's actually in our family. And the other thing I noticed is this upper middle class sphere of people here on the shores of Lake Michigan, there was no obesity. Whereas if you go to the Walmart in Michigan City, half the people are obese.
Right.
So I come away from an event. I mean, this has just happened. This would be a Jane Goodall moment. I come away with that event. Not only did I eat my dinner and watch the fireworks, but I was assessing who that 1,000 of people were in Lakeside, Michigan.
Doing a little anthropological dissect.
Yeah, right. And you know what? There are a lot of people who do that who don't realize they do it.
Right.
And in the book, I talk about my experience with Vernon Jordan, who was, truly a massively charismatic figure. I would assume that most people know who he was. He was a civil rights leader and eventually became a major figure in business and politics. Very, very striking, handsome black man. And but he could tell you 6 months after any cocktail party how many people in that room were black who were not wait staff.
Right.
That's the way it is. So there are different levels at which we operate. And my level is presence, but also observation.
Sure. So we mentioned before boldface names, and I can't list them all here, but you know, 4 presidents: Carter, Clinton, Obama, Trump. You published their books: Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Natan Sharansky, Robert McNamara. The list goes on. I won't attempt to list them all. Were you ever starstruck?
No, I think that was one of the advantages of coming in as a reporter. Reporters, if reporters are starstruck, it gets in their way.
Right.
And one of the things, I knew, you know, as a reporter, I covered a lot of big time folks, but it was as a editor and publisher that I really, really came into contact with people. And I always used to say that being an editor and a publisher in particular, I was never an employee. These were people who wanted something from me,
right,
which was the support that they needed to be able to do something they wanted, which is have a book.
So you were on a more equal footing with him.
Right, especially as I got older. And the thing is that because I would go into it without a sense of insecurity about the, you know, listen, put it this way. If I was a dentist and they came to me with a toothache, I would know what to do. These are people who came to me. These are people who came to me who either wanted to write a book or wanted to publish a book. And after I figured out how the business worked, felt that I was able to do that. And so that made the relationship, I wouldn't say 100% because it's not the case, but I would say overwhelmingly, I was able to deal with the people I was dealing with, no matter what level they were, without a sense that I was, you know, out of my depth. And that's merciful.
Right. So you mentioned Vernon Jordan, who obviously had a lot of charisma. Who had this? Well, I'll just ask it. So who had the most Elvis?
Most what?
The most Elvis.
Me. Elvis is my grandfather name. This is another case of me choosing when my first grandkids were born, and I said, yeah, I don't want to be known as Poopy or Oopie or Up or anything. I said, so call me Elvis. They didn't know it was funny. Now they know it's funny. But I am Elvis, the 5 grandkids.
Okay, well, see, no, there's no setup here. I had no idea. Okay,
I am and will always be Elvis to my grandkids. I think that well, I would have to say that in different ways. I mean, there are different ways. Obviously, you know, I mentioned Vernon. People like Vernon Jordan and Magic Johnson, in particular, really, any room they were in, nobody could look anywhere else, you know, for a while. The striking thing about, let's go to the presidents, because that's really probably the most important historically. Jimmy Carter, I encountered first when he was, you know, recently been defeated. He was back in Plains.
Right.
Trying to get started. And in a nutshell, my time with the Carter, I did a bunch of books with him, including one book of poetry, a children's book. And I really got to spend time with he and Rosalind sitting in their kitchen, holding hands, saying grace, all that other business. Jimmy Carter was the person who he pretended to be. He also, somewhere in his sort of sense of self, was tremendous ambition and a tremendous sense of mission. But he's a real human being in the full sense of the thing, for better, I think for better, but, you know, in some sense, as a politician, he ended up with one term. Clinton was somebody who clearly had immense natural charisma.
Right.
Which But I also, the first book I did with him was very easy. It was his 1992 political manifesto, he and Gore, and it didn't require really any engagement. But the second book involved engagement. And what I saw was a guy who was immensely charismatic and in some sense infuriatingly undisciplined when it came to, he could be cruel in ways he didn't want to be. And I think that, well, his marriage to Hillary, I think, would be a perfect example of that. Sure. I am not reflecting any of that.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm trying to get the book out of him in 1996 when I was under the gun to get the book. It was really hard. He was the president. He kept telling me how much he wanted to do the book, and I kept, waiting for something to happen, and we did eventually do it. That's all in the book. Obama is another, unexpectedly great story. Obama was first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review, got a big contract from Simon & Schuster, not that he asked for, but that they gave him. I'm sure he had loans to pay. He missed his deadline. They canceled the book. They came to me and said, you want to pick up this book that's been canceled for $40,000? I did. It's Dreams of My Father. It's sold 4 million copies. I never got a t-shirt. But on the other hand, I knew when I met him that this was I met him in 1994. So he was a young community organizer.
Right.
I knew then that I was dealing with somebody who would be extraordinary. I don't know why. I just did. There was something about his presence, something about his the way he handled himself, and the nature of our conversation. And then Donald Trump. I met Donald Trump because I was tasked early on in my Random House period by the owner of the company, who said, this Trump fellow is a comer, let's do a book.
And that was Cy Newhouse.
Cy Newhouse and his best friend, Roy Cohn, the New York fixer. Cy didn't really interfere much in the nature of acquisition of books, but that was what he wanted to do. And I was the one who was given the
And you tell the great story about showing up and you show him the mock-up of the cover, and immediately says, my name's not big enough.
It wasn't big enough. One of the things we came to understand about Donald Trump is that irony is not part of his makeup. But so I did have a chance over really literally a 5-year period to see Trump up close. So when everybody started having really strong opinions about Trump, I was able to have my opinions based on experience. And what I say, again, to keep it simple, is the person I saw as a New York developer in the late 80s and early 90s is the same person who became the president of the United States, only he was the president of the United States and not a developer.
Right. And
they had many of the same characteristics, much sort of exaggerated. And that's what we're living with now. He has an uncanny ability to reach a certain kind of people against every expectation. Why? Again, an anecdote that a year or so after we published the book, but before he was on The Apprentice, my son and I were at a professional wrestling in Atlantic City because Evan had a brief interest in watching it. And 18,000 people in the arena. Trump's the promoter of this event. And when he comes in, people cheer and they roar. And that's before The Apprentice.
Right.
That is strictly on the basis of the book and his reputation. So Donald Trump, even then, 1988, 89, could reach an audience which eventually became enough of an audience in this country to make him president of the United States, which is incredible.
It is.
And what it is what that intangible is with him. I still don't think we fully know. I am not one who believes that, it's wrong to say that he has the same gifts as other sort of autocrats or Mussolini made the trains run on time. Trump built the Wallman rink ahead of schedule. Those are things that, why it is that so many people in this country would choose to vote for him, even knowing after he'd been president for 4 years what he was like, is an astonishing fact, which I still to this day cannot fully explain.
Well, let's come back to that because that's a broader political discussion. But you also mentioned Natan Sharansky and the book and your admiration for him as, I think it's really the only person in the book that you identify as something of a hero to you.
Mhm.
Why?
Well,
You met him
for-
when you met him when you were in Moscow.
I was a reporter in Moscow, and he was introduced to me shortly after I got there as a quote spokesman for Jews who wanted to immigrate. And I looked at him, he was in his mid-20s, short, kind of dumpy guy. I said, "You're the spokesman." Anyway, the point about it is, over time, and it's been 40 years, I saw Natan in various ways show extraordinary integrity, extraordinary courage. In March of 1997, March of 1977, he was arrested by the KGB and taken to the fort of the prison, stripped naked, told he was being charged with a capital offense, treason. And the thought that goes through his mind is, they cannot humiliate me, only I can humiliate myself, which in a sense is the ultimate existential insight.
And
9 years later.
And I never heard that put that way, but I thought that was an amazing, I don't know, it's just a very powerful thought.
Well, it is. And 9 years later, they let him out in a pretend spy trade, although he's not a spy. And they tell him to cross the Gleinecke Bridge in Berlin in a straight line. So what he's doing, he's holding up his pants and he crosses it in a zigzag line. It's not belligerence. It's a belief in himself. And in Israel, he became a star, became a politician, and he'll tell you that he was a much better political prisoner than he was a politician.
And became closely aligned with Netanyahu, correct?
Yeah, and there's a whole story about that, which I can mention very quickly. But the point is, he says, I was in 3 prisons. I never resigned from any. I was in 3 governments. I resigned from all of them. And he likes to say, as a political prisoner, I was an inspiration. As a dissident, I was an inspiration. As a politician, I was a disappointment. He's very much aware of the fact that his association in what in Israel is the right, well, not the far right. He's a secular person, even though his wife is very observant. To boil it down, his belief is that you cannot make peace with the Palestinians or anybody else until there is a real foundation of democracy. And he believes that things like the Oslo Accord were giving gifts to the Palestinians that they had not earned. Now, you may argue with that as a contention, but that's his belief, and I understand why he feels that way. But finally, and this is really very important, the KGB decided that he and I were partners in crime, as he puts it. And I was attacked pretty much relentlessly in the last year or so when we were there as his handler. And in the end, I went home and he went to prison. So I've always felt, whether I can actually, how exactly to describe it, we were linked then. We're both Jews. We're both more or less the same age. His life was defined by his determination to live in freedom. And one of the people who was, part of that process was me as a journalist, because I wrote about him, and then later as an editor and publisher, because I published his books. So that's
how many books did you do with him?
4. The first one was Fear No Evil, which was his prison book, which was a magnificent book, which is still in print, but commercially a disappointment because it came at the time when Reagan and Gorbachev were hugging and kissing in Red Square, and a dissident prison book was not fashionable at that moment. It did fine.
Yeah.
The second book he did was called The Case for Democracy. And the story there is that George W. Bush got a copy of the book because I sent it to a friend of mine who was his partner in the Rangers. Texas folks will like this. George W. Bush got the copy of the book, is in the White House, he reads it, He says, this is the most important book I've ever read. Uses it as the basis for his second inauguration and touts the book. The book became a big bestseller. And Natan's private comment was, he thought it was the best book he ever read because he only read the first 200 pages. It is a very good book. It's the case for democracy, which is what I was describing before, which is that you can't have democracy until you have real civic institutions and social justice. Then he did a book on identity, and most recently he did a book called Never Alone, which is a kind of the three big phases of his life, which is his life as a dissident and political prisoner, his life as a politician, and his life in the last episode of his career, which was as head of the Jewish agency, the purpose of which is to try to build relationships with the diaspora at a time when relations between the Israelis and the diaspora have really deteriorated very much. I mean, the degree which Israel now represents a divisive factor in American Jewish life instead of a source of inspiration. So anyway, that's the book. He's a grandfather 7 or 8 times over now. And he's still a little guy. He's still bald, and he's still a hero.
That's a great story. Let me ask you about another Russian that I find fascinating is Gary Kasparov. You published him as well, right? At Public Affairs.
I did, but I had nothing to do with him. Okay. He was published by Public Affairs, but by that time I was only 10 cents. I've met him, of course, but I wouldn't dream of playing. Sharansky could play chess with him, but I wouldn't even sit down with him on that score. So I can't really talk about him.
Okay. Well, so let's zoom out a little bit here, Peter. And again, my guest is Peter Osnos. His book is called An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen, which came out in June, if I recall.
Right.
So you've been in publishing, as you mentioned, for 50 years. You've been a reporter for 60, as you mentioned. And by the way, in high school, you met Stokely Carmichael. I mean, again, this was one.
It was James. College, James Meredith, and Stokely came later, standing on the board working. That's a whole other.
Okay. All right.
Folks,
Okay.
Let me tell you, if you think there's nothing to read in this book, you're not paying attention.
Well, I mean, you end up in all these places and think, oh my God, how is this possible? But anyway. So you worked at the Washington Post. You're familiar with big media outlets. The New York Times, the Washington Post now are attacked regularly as part of the big media. And are they as important now as they were? And if is the age? I guess the question that I wrote down is the age of those big media outlets over?
No, absolutely not. Look, I think there are two things about the way information is presented. One is content, and the other is distribution. Content of one kind or another is pretty much eternal, going all the way back to the very beginning in cave paintings. What's changed over and changes is the way information is distributed. And the major change in information in the last half century, say, and particularly the last 30 years, is that each one of us has become editor-in-chief. We choose what we want. Someone listening to this podcast is making a choice. They don't have to listen to this podcast.
Right.
And so the way it now works is that distribution is no longer supported by advertising. Distribution is supported by the engagement of subscribers. And that's a fundamental change. So what the New York Times is today is a newspaper intended to be read by as many of the English language readers there are in the world, of which there are 100 million outside the United States. So they have a major bureau in Australia and Canada. They don't have a bureau in the Bronx. It's a global English language newspaper. There's a whole other thing which is going on at the Times, which is how do we appeal to the next generation, which is why they cover, certain kinds of culture and gender issues very, very carefully. That's a separate issue. It's a global newspaper. The Washington Post, when I was there, was a Washington newspaper. The Catherine Graham's great line about that was that the Washington Post is Woodward and Bernstein. It's also Woodward and Lothrop, which was the department store downtown. Then Woodward and Lothrop went out of business. So the Post had to find a new way of reaching people. That's when Bezos came along and bought it and turned it into another global brand. It's an international brand, which has many, many more subscribers, most of whom are digital, than it ever had when I was there. So its power and impact comes from scale. But we are, as a culture, now we are in a position, which I think is both a major responsibility and an obligation, to choose where we get our information from. And because on the local level, in places like Austin, Texas, we don't have a truly good sustainable business model for local journalism, which is why it's having to be reinvented, why so much of it has been demolished, and we're starting to rebuild it. One of the great successes in the new age of journalism is the Texas Tribune, which was started now, I guess, almost 20 years ago.
Right.
And the truth is that the Texas Tribune understood something, that it needed to be an asset to the community it served without advertising. So what does it do? It provides you with a variety of ways to support it: philanthropy, membership, events, and that's how it pays the rent.
Right.
And one of the things that journalism, media, public book publishers, everybody needs to find a way to pay the rent. Book publishers never had advertising. We didn't lose it. Book publishers were always thought to be on the verge of extinction and never have been. The truth is that we have always had an engagement with our readers. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. And journalism has had to develop the same characteristic: engagement with readers. The networks no longer have the audience and power they once had because they were based on advertising. So now I pay whatever I pay to get Netflix and all the other, things that I get. There's no advertising. I'm paying for it. I'm a subscriber. One of the things that I get a lot of laughter out of people when I talk to them about the cable industry, cable news.
Sure.
When I talk to a kind of audience I would talk to, I'd say, so how many of you, read the New York Times? How many of you read the New Yorker? How many of you read, the Atlantic? How many of you subscribe to Fox News? Everybody goes, I subscribe to Fox News. Everybody subscribes to Fox News if you have cable.
Right.
You don't know it, but you're paying them a significant amount of money for the pleasure and privilege of having Fox News. That's being given to you, but you don't have to watch it. You choose to watch it.
So what your point is just the way the revenue, the revenue side of the business has worked, or is how that's the main change.
The main change in distribution is that that you have to get people to engage with money and not advertisers.
Right. Because
the advertisers are less valuable to you than they once were.
So
the consumer chooses what they want instead of being told what they can have.
So does the fact that Bezos owns the Post and that there's that the biggest media outlets are controlled by, I could use the word oligarchs in the U.S. It's not exactly the right word, but Laurene Jobs owns the Atlantic. Murdoch, of course, owns the Post, the Wall Street Journal, and all of his News Corp, et cetera, Fox News. Does that concern you at all that these massive outlets are controlled by the billionaires?
Well, the New York Times is not.
Yeah.
The New York Times is the only, and the New York Times is, let's face it, the leading news organization in this country still in terms of prestige. And
right.
Probably. And what about it? Every other family-owned news organization in the country folded. The Grahams at the Post, the Chandlers in Los Angeles, the Binghams in Louisville, the Taylors in Boston, the Abels in Baltimore, everybody, and the McClatchys and the Knights and the Ritters, they all gave up, but not the Sulzbergers. And why didn't the Sulzbergers give up? Well, probably, and I think the only way to describe it is that they believed deeply in the mission that they had. They were willing to forego their dividends. They really, they battened down the hatches. They were walking around in proverbial barrels for a while. And then they understood that there were two things they had to do to save the institution. One was to create a paywall, which they have. And two was to make it a truly national newspaper. So sitting out here in rural Michigan, I get the paper the same time as I do on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I'm a paper reader. Plus they have those digital readers. All right. So the Times is an exception, which you would argue proves the rule. And maybe it does on the global level, on the national level. But what's happening on the local level is not moguls. If a community wants to really support good journalism, the community has to step up and do that.
Right.
My extraordinarily gifted and competent, loved daughter-in-law is the chief executive of something called the American Journalism Project, which is actually started by John Thornton, the same fellow who started the Texas Tribune. And what it does is it provides money and resources and mentoring for local journalism, to rebuild local nonprofit journalism. You know, the truth is, Robert, you're doing a podcast. What is a podcast? Podcast is radio. What is radio? Radio is the ultimate analog broadcast. And yet, here we are today, you're doing a podcast. News of one kind or another has always been there and always will. Is it as good as it could be? Never will be. But is it good? You know what you're looking for. You can get great coverage of almost anything.
Sure.
And but it's a responsibility that a great many people just don't know how to deal with. The civic responsibility of supporting journalism with your readership and your money is major. Don't expect Woodward and Lothrop to pick up the tab. You may have to pick up the tab.
So that's one of the questions I read. It was with the biggest trend in media now, and I guess if I paraphrase what you said, it's this atomization of the business, right?
It's at some level it's atomization, but really the biggest trend is that we moved from we're going to give you what we want to give you, supported by advertising, to you're going to take what you want, but you got to figure out a way to support it.
So that's it's gone from publisher push to consumer pull.
Absolutely. I think that's the most, I think that's in any number of ways the biggest development in media. And it's the reason why so much of the media has been in upheaval, because what was always assumed to be the major source of income has very largely dried up.
So you mentioned the New York Times and that you get it, you're in Lakeside, Michigan. So what publications do you read on an average day besides the New York Times?
Well, I'm not typical, so I mean, it's really unfair. I read the Times and the Journal in print. I read the FT and the Washington Post online. Obviously, I read the New Yorker, where my son is a writer, and the New York Review of Books. I'm I can't pass a matchbook without reading it. So, and I'm, I have slightly. When it comes to what my preferred platform is, there are some things I prefer. I really am a print book reader, but there are some books I don't need to put on my shelf that I would just download and look at. I'm not an inveterate podcast listener, although I must say I think the daily at the Times is a very helpful thing to have. And again, I'll tell you something about that, Robert. If you ask people at the New York Times, which is now digital first, right? Digital first. What do they really care about most? One thing they care about still is their first time on the front page of the paper, because they get it enshrined in some sort of brass, key.
Right.
And the second is being on the daily, because in the New York Times journalism today, usually 4 or 5 bylines on every story. On the daily, it's just you. People love being noticed on the front page and love being interviewed on the daily. Human nature has its consistencies, and one of them is people are, they like to be proud of what they do.
Yeah,
and I think that's one of the ways in which journalism will always endure. There are people who should not be proud of what they do, and God, that's their problem.
Right.
But an awful lot of journalists are proud of what they do. proud of what they've been able to achieve, proud of what they've been able to contribute. And to me, that's very encouraging. And I think that will always be the case.
I have been, it's been remarkable when it took me a while to get the podcast started, but I'm doing it more than a year now. And it's people really react to it. I mean, they really listen, and it's been remarkable. And some of the response that I've had, and I'm just to stop with this, but at a deeper level than some of the things I've written. I mean, just that they really do listen closely. So we've talked about the future of book publishing, and I'm with you. I read a lot of my Kindle. I read your book on the Kindle. Only because I wanted it right away and I wanted to get started. And there's some things about that I like, but I still, I like the I love the paper. I love to be able to underline it and come back and open the thing itself. I like the thingness of the book. But let's talk about platform, because we've been talking for right about an hour now, Peter. So you formed this new imprint Platform, and you published, your book was the first book to be published by Platform?
Yes.
Do you have other books in the queue there? Or what else are you publishing?
I'm not trying to reinvent public affairs. I've done that. Public affairs, as I said, is 24 years old and is now part of a shed. But we're going, we've got another book in the works. It's going to be published in partnership with the Harvard Business Review Press, coming next spring. It's a full, extensive view of the life and experiences of George Soros, called George Soros: A Life in Full. And what I published these books in Public Affairs, and what I concluded was no one was going to be able to pull off a really good biography of him, because there's too many other aspects. He's a financier, he's a philanthropist, he's a political figure. He's his multiple phase. He's a Holocaust survivor. So what we did was we got people who would be the best people to write about those various aspects of his life. And what we did was we got his promise, assurance, that he would not read the book until it was done.
So it's a series of vignettes about Soros then?
Not vignettes. These are 15,000 word essays or 10,000 word essays. That's what they are.
Okay.
By people like Sebastian Mallaby on finance and Darren Walker on philanthropy. I mean, it's classy. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. Sure. Because I wanted it to get a certain kind of distribution, we're partnering with the Harvard Business Review Press. And we'll do a couple, but I'm not, I'm in what we call, Robert, the encore, or I call it repositioning phase, which is, I don't like the term retirement, because retirement implies you're done, right? And what I say in the book, and I've gotten a lot of interesting response to this, is that if you make it to 65 in today's world, odds are you're going to get it to 85. And that means 1/3 of your adult life is going to be spent after what was thought of as the quote retirement age.
Right.
What we need to do is figure out how to make use of that time. That the traditional work arc, which was this, has to be reinvented to this. So that I knew that there was a point at which I could no longer lead public affairs and shouldn't. Right. And I had to understand that I was stepping back. It wasn't disrespect that the people wanted to do it on their own. They just needed to.
Right.
Right. So.
And you make that point in the book that you were at some points seen as meddling, and that they needed to do it themselves. But let me follow on the issue of public affairs here, because it's the only. I've had an unusual career in book publishing, and I'll make this very. I had the same agent, the same editor, Lisa Kaufman, the same agent, Dan Green, you mentioned in the memoir with regard to Molly Ivins, who wrote the foreword to my first book, Pipe Dreams. But I've had a very unusual career in book publishing, same editor, same agent, and same publisher. So, but I didn't know all the history of public affairs, and you recounted the story of the founding and also the financing of getting the business started. And admitting fully to your missteps in how it was set up, and that none of the investors got their money back.
No, that's not. See, that's one way of putting it. I wouldn't say that. I'd say the investors achieved with what they came to it for, which is to create a publishing company of consequence and value. I'm mission driven. I'm not profit driven.
Okay. I guess, well, let me just all that. So would you do it again? Would you do public affairs?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't do it any different way. I mean, the one thing I would do differently, and again, it's described in the book, is I would probably take a tougher position on majority ownership, what
Right.
represents majority ownership. But the other thing is that I came to understand is very simple, Robert. If you want to run a successful company in almost any line of work, and you're mission driven rather than profit driven, your goal is enough at the bottom line to pay all your expenses in a proper way. And that's what we did. We never defaulted. We never, screwed anybody. And you think, did the investors get that? No, none of the people except for me was putting money into the company that was consequential. And what did I get? In all the years I was there, which turned out to be, almost, 16, 18, 20 years of one kind or another, there's nothing I could have done with my buck that would have been more rewarding and really more profitable. And you know what? The reason why you did 6 books with Public Affairs is because somewhere in your sense of what matters, it wasn't just about the money. And I'd say all the time to people, if you're only in this for the size of your advance, find another publisher.
Right.
Because you probably get more money somewhere else. One of the things I always said from the beginning, to publish the kinds of books that we were going to do, we had to recognize the finite nature of our audience. It's a great big country with lots of interests, and the number of people who were going to buy one of the public affairs books was maybe 10% of the entire population.
Right.
Let me just say this about my own book, Robert. In the course of publicizing this book, I've been on NPR and PBS, and I've done scores of other events, and C-SPAN ran me over and over and over again, and there were reviews in the Wall Street Journal elsewhere. Probably reached 15, 18, 20 million people, one way or another. The number of people who are actually going to buy the book is going to be 0.01%.
Right.
Because of the nature of the book and the nature of the mission. You have to recognize that there's a difference between what you want as a revenue return and what is possible.
Right.
And one of the reasons why public affairs exists is I got to say in the book, but there's also a Wall Street Journal ad I cut out and gave to everybody was the average company doesn't last 20 years. What does it take to get to be 100? And we're 24.
Right.
And one of the reasons we are at 24 is, whether I knew it or not, I was navigating the business outside the realm of whether it would have a profit return that would make people happy. If they wanted to be happy, buy a bond. If you wanted to be in public affairs, as long as we paid those bills, because believe me, Robert, if we weren't paying our bills, we would not have made it. Nobody was doing us a favor.
Sure.
So the source of pride I have is that complicated, but at the end of the day, Hachette, one of the major book companies in the world, not only did they want to own public affairs, but they've treated it with immense respect. They did not change the business model. Nobody lost their jobs. It's what it is. It's just, I'm not there.
Sure.
But the point is that I, again, and these are instinctive things, Robert. I just understood that if I was going to be a book publisher, it had to be a certain kind of book published a certain kind of way. We had to pay our bills. I didn't want anybody to come along and save us.
And it was targeted for a certain kind of audience.
Exactly right.
Right. So
kind of people who will be listening to your podcast or reading your books.
I hope so. So just a couple last questions, Peter. My guest is Peter Osnos. He's the author of An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. And he also has it on audiobook. So we've talked a lot about what you're reading. So you've mentioned the periodicals. What books are you reading?
Oh, right at the moment, it's interesting. I'm reading, I just finished, for some reason, I got 3 books, the last 3, nighttime read before I go to sleep. One was Edmund Morris's book on Teddy as president, TR. The second one was a book about the 1912 campaign called Let the People Rule by Jeff Cowan. This was my Teddy period. I'm now halfway through the new biography of Jimmy Carter. So I guess I'm, my daytime, and then the other thing I'm doing for my reading group of old men is War and Peace.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And how far are you through it?
Well, I've got 20 hours to go on the audio, and I'm on page 700. The thing, what I'm doing is, in order to read War and Peace properly, you need to listen, you need to have the book in front of you, you need to compare the thing, and you need to keep looking back at the characters. So the challenge for me is, as one of my summer projects, is to read War and Peace. But I tell you that I always, I'm sure you are the same. I always have a book or two by my side, and almost completely nonfiction, because that's my thing.
Yeah.
And usually history, biography, that kind of.
Sure. So last question, what gives you hope? You've had a remarkable career. You've had it ups and downs, which you also detail in the book, and we don't have to recount all of those, but you're 77, you've had a remarkable career there. You're planning on keep going. What gives you hope?
Well, that's exactly the point. If you don't get hit by a bus, or the equivalent in some other way of cancer, dementia, something, you just keep going. And the real issue for me about my generation is that we do have this extra time and that we should use it. We're a generation, for the first time in human history, that is living as long as we are with our wits. And even though all of us are going to have health problems of one kind or another, still very much able to function properly, unless, dementia, cancer, one of the other things. So what gives me hope is that there's this enormous time in which you're not really doing it because you want to, put your kids through school, or, you need to get prestige of a certain kind of career. As I said, I think we need to understand there's a point at which you stop your passage up the greasy pole. You either made it or you didn't, but then get off and start doing other things that give you inspiration or motivation, but are not necessarily going to make you, rich and famous. It's called encore for a lot of people. There are a lot of different ways to describe it. I call it repositioning. And it's very important to me and to my entire, listen, I grew up with a bunch of fellas, mostly, who ended up running stuff.
Right.
But we're all in our 70s and none of us are, or should be. So what are we doing? And the hope that I have is that we will do things that are worthwhile, in which our experience is valued, in which people come to us and say, you've been around a while. What do you know? And please tell me. And that's my hope.
Well, that's a good place to stop then. My guest has been Peter Osnos. He's the author of An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. He was a publisher at Public Affairs for all of my books, so I owe him a debt of gratitude, not only for coming on the podcast, but helping me get into the publishing business. So Peter, many thanks for both of those things. And to all of you in podcast land, thanks for tuning in, and tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. So until then, thanks again.